about you guys, but 2022 was a super busy year for me. As you guys know, a lot of life changes, and one of the things that really got me through and one of the things that really kept me reading were audiobooks. And there are multiple books that I fell in love with this year that I listened to on audio that I wanted to kind of talk to you about today, but what I really want to focus on is the narration. I have listened to so many awful audiobooks over the last year, and there were a few, I think I have 5 here, audiobook narrators that really stood out to me that I wanted to share with you guys, because I think audiobooks are a fantastic resource. And what kind of spurred this is because Rocco and I listen to a ton of audiobooks. So if we're trying to go to sleep or if we're in the car, whatever it might be, and he started, even himself as like not necessarily like the biggest reader, noticing how important it was for the narrator to be able to really make the book come alive. And the first narrator that I'm going to start out with is Ray Porter. Ray Porter has quite the extensive work list here, but he has done We Are Legion, We Are Bob. He's done The Martian, Silver Linings Playbook, but the one that I really want to talk about is Project Hail Mary. I think he has this fantastic inflection. You really feel for the characters that he's creating with his voice, and he is able to, you're really able to differentiate between the characters. I sometimes find that the narrator is really just reading the book and not necessarily acting the book, because I think audio narrators are actors in a way, because they are supposed to convey the story, they're supposed to convey the emotion of the characters. And I think where Ray really stands out is Project Hail Mary, because there are a ton of different characters in this book, male and female, not necessarily from their perspective, but there is a lot of dialogue that happens within the book, and it's very easy to pick out like who may be speaking at the time. And to top it all off, there's a friggin' alien in this book, and he even does his voice perfectly. I think that he is very good at making the characters stand out and making you really, really care for them. He's also very emotional. I think that's also really important. I think when intense things are happening, or like in this book, in Project Hail Mary, there is a lot of like internal dialogue happening, and the character is, you know, going through his mind and thinking about his past actions, his current actions, just the hopelessness of being lost in space. And I think Ray does a really fantastic job at like conveying that. And I think it is invaluable in an audiobook narrator, and he has become a comfort narrator for me. I've listened to Project Hail Mary a few times now at this point, and it has topped one of my favorite books of all time, and not just because of the book itself, but also because of the narrator. Ray really truly brings that whole entire story to life. The next narrator I want to talk about is Simon Vance. I think more popularly he may be known for Dune, but he has done George R.R. Martin books as well. He has done The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo by Stieg Larsson, but I love him for The Black Prism. If you guys have not listened to that audiobook, it is truly fantastic, especially the one narrated by Simon. I believe there is like a full cast one. I don't know if you've seen those audiobooks that are like the full cast with sound, all of that, but I found Simon to be really refreshing in a way. So he does have more, and I don't necessarily know if it's because of the like the contents of the book, but he has more of a fantasy feel, and he is another one of those authors that absolutely nails being able to differentiate characters and make you really care for them. I think where he stands out the most is there's a main character in this series called Kip, and Kip is one of my least liked characters probably of all time. I find him very, I don't know, annoying in a way, but Simon does such a good job of actually making you care about Kip in the book, and he has this wonderful inflection and this very, like I said, soothing kind of voice, which is also really refreshing because he does read such large books like Dune, Interview with a Vampire. I believe he did Fire and Blood by George R.R. Martin. So he tends to stick to like the big, hefty books, or the ones that have a lot of meat to them or a lot happening in them. And in some way he is able to soothe you through that, which I think is really refreshing, because sometimes you'll get audiobook narrators that read fantasy and it's very drawling, very boring, it's hard to get into, and I think that's obviously not the point of an audiobook. And I think Simon does a fantastic job of really just roping you in, and like I said, he just has such a soothing voice. Like when I think of him, that's what I think of. I think of a really cozy, comfy kind of audiobook narrator. So the next narrator I want to talk about is I would think one of the more versatile narrators that I've heard of, and it's Emily Wu Zeller. So originally I know her from The Bride Test, and I love her for that book because if you are a fan of the romance genre and you do read them in audiobook format, you know that a lot of those books can be incredibly cringy. But Emily also has a history of doing general fiction or fantasy. So she did most recently do the Cartographers, but she has done in the past the Poppy War, the Bone Witch. So I think she's just very versatile in that way, and she stands out with every different one that she does. I find her not cringy, which I think is incredibly important to the romance genre. I find her voice very soothing and rich, which once again, depending on the content that you're listening to, so if you're listening to a romance novel, like obviously it's a little bit graphic, so it's really nice to have a voice that isn't cringy, that is more on the soothing side. And then we have books like The Poppy War, which I have not read, but I have heard is a very intense read. So to have, once again, another, like a very soothing voice for that, I think she really stands out. And I just really love her voice as well. Like, to listen to it, it's kind of like listening to a melody, and she stands out in that way for me. I listened to the Cartographers and The Bride Test with her as the narrator, and it was just a chef's kiss. Now, the next narrator I want to talk about is Julia Whelan. I don't know if I'm saying that 100% correct. She's done Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, After I Do by Taylor Jenkins Reid, and The Wife Between Us. So she's got quite a bit of depth here, but the two that really stood out for me are two that I actually read this past year, and it would be Book Lovers and The Invisible Life of Addie Larue. What I really like is that she definitely embodies her character. So in Book Lovers, the main character is kind of just a cold-hearted bitch the whole time, up until, you know, like halfway, 3/4 of the way through the book. And she manages to capture that character so well. But if you go to The Invisible Life of Addie Larue, you really hear the inflection and the tone change. It really makes me feel like Julia takes her job really seriously, because she looks at the content of the book, she really dives deep into the characters and, you know, understands that and has that inflection and really brings the story to life in that way. And like I said, it's most obvious in these two books, I think, for me. I think that for me, one of the most standout audiobooks for the last year would have been Addie Larue. I think she just has, like I said, just a whimsical kind of voice in that book, and she really brings like I would say the heaviness of the story to life in the way that she kind of slows down and the way that she narrates. If you're looking for a quicker audiobook narration, I wouldn't necessarily go with her as the audiobook narrator. I think when if you're like me, if she's sped up a little bit, that little art form that she has of like the inflection and bringing those characters to life, I think when you speed it up, that's really lost for her. But if you're looking for a book to really get into, to really absorb, I would do Addie Larue. I think that book is just fantastic with her as the audiobook narrator. Second to last one that I have here is January LaVoy. January LaVoy narrates The 10,000 Doors of January. And the best way to describe her voice is just luscious. Like, it's very full. That book is a very whimsical kind of fantasy novel in ways. It's more like magical realism, but she brings it to life in a way that it adds so much to the story, which I think is saying a lot, because a lot of the time when you read an audiobook, it feels like the narrator is kind of taking away from the story a little bit, because I think a lot of us, when we read a book, like, we are enacting everything in our head. We have the voices for the characters, or how we think they may speak based on what we're reading, or, you know, kind of how we picture the character in our head. And January does such a good job at this. She has excellent inflection. She is such a dynamic audiobook narrator as well. She's done things from Identity by Nora Roberts, The Longest Ride by Nicholas Sparks. She's done James Patterson and Ken Follett books. She also does Star Wars books. So January is just all over the place when it comes to the books that she reads, and she brings so much to every single one of them. She has such a standout voice for me. I think when you hear her, you're like, okay, that's January. If you're looking for a really good read, one of my favorite books of all time is 10,000 Doors of January. So I would get, if you can, the audiobook narration with January in there. It is just going to be one of the best books I think that you'll read this year. So the next narrator that I have on here for a very specific reason, and it scratches a very specific itch, and it is Nick Podehl, who does Name of the Wind. He also does a ton of Patrick Ness books. He does a ton by Andrew Rowe. If you've not heard of him, he does like the Arcane Ascension series, and I believe he has another series that he recently did. But the reason why Nick stands out for me is because he is reading a much younger MC's story. So there are multiple characters in this book, especially towards the beginning of the book, and Nick does a fantastic job at describing them, especially like the villains of this book. Like he has great inflection, but he's also very like fun in a way. He has really good inflection, like I said, but where he gets me the most is he excels at narrating a younger main character. And I've struggled in the past with younger characters and the narrator sounding, you know, years and years older. And I think that is something that is really important when reading an audiobook. Like the narrator is there not necessarily just to read you the story, but also to get you into the story, to help you connect with the characters. And that would be based on their voice and in relation to the character that they are narrating. And Nick does such a good job. He is another one of these authors that not because he sucks, but he makes me fall asleep. Like he makes me so comfy and like just like very like bundled up, warm, kind of like when I think of him, I think of like a cold winter's day, like being bundled up by a fire kind of feel. I think he does a fantastic job at that. So if you haven't read The Name of the Wind and you are looking for like a narrator with a little bit more of like a lighter voice, who brings a lot of dynamic to the story, and you've been wanting to read this book but finding it too big, I would recommend the audiobook, especially with Nick narrating it. It's fantastic, and it is, I think, the easiest way when you find a good narrator to get through like an incredibly large book. It's much easier to read it in that way, as opposed to sitting down with this like 500, 600, 700, 900 page book and attempting to read it yourself. I think they add something to it. And then every single one of these narrators that I talked about today, I think adds something special to every book that they narrate. So those are the 6, I thought I had 5, the 6 narrators that I had that I wanted to talk to you guys about today. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Let me know down below other narrators that you really enjoy. I think a lot of people think of like Jim Dale and like the classics, but I think these, you know, really stand out to me. So if you have something kind of along the same lines of these, let me know, especially in the romance genre and in the fantasy genre. But I love you guys a lot. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in my next video.